Hey, Mrs. Colgan again. Here we go, continuing. As you can tell, Mrs. Baker had me reading The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, for May, which I think was punishment for taking off April. This was slow stuff, and even Romeo had it all over Hamlet. The ghost was okay, and the gravediggers, but when you write about characters who talk too much, the only way that you can show that they talk too much is to make them talk too much, and that just gets annoying. So anytime I saw a speech by Hamlet or Polonius or, well, just about anybody, I skipped over it pretty quickly, and I don't think I missed a thing. I shared this insight into reading Shakespeare with Mara Lee, who, by the way, was not going to move, who now knew who Mickey Mantle was, and who had memorized the entire Yankee roster. I don't think that's a good way to read something, said Mara Lee. Why not? You can't just skip the boring parts. Of course I can skip the boring parts. How do you know they're boring if you don't read them? I can tell. Then you can't say you've read the whole play. I think I can still live a happy life, Mara Lee, even if I don't read the boring parts of The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Who knows, she said. Maybe you can't. I tried my insight into reading Shakespeare on Mrs. Baker. We're on page 216. I see, said Mrs. Baker. But doesn't this play in particular pose a problem for your new method, Mr. Hoodhood? What problem? That there are no boring parts in this, Shakespeare's greatest play of all. She looked at me, and she almost folded her arms across her chest, but stopped at the last second. I guess that would be a problem, I said. Read it all, said Mrs. Baker, even Polonius. And if it gets boring? It won't get boring. It already is boring. Then I suggest you start again. This is a story of a son who is asked to take vengeance for what has happened to his father, who has been dreadfully murdered. But he's not sure he can trust anyone in his family. What might you do in such a situation? I'd run over the murderer with a Ford Mustang, short of that colorful extremity. Well, I guess I'd start. Well, I said, I guess I'd start by looking around for someone to trust. Mrs. Baker nodded. Now, she said, begin the play. The next day, right after lunch recess, the atomic bomb sirens wailed again in Camillo Junior High. I guess Leonid Brezhnev was still at it. We scrunched under our desks again and put our hands over our heads. No talking. Absolute silence. Breathe quietly and evenly. This rots, said Danny Hupfer. No talking, please, said Mrs. Baker. I have a question, said Danny. After the drill, said Mrs. Baker. This is important, said Danny. Mrs. Baker sighed. What is it, Mr. Hupfer? Isn't it dangerous for you not to be under your desk? Thank you for your concern. I will take the risk. But suppose an atomic bomb was really coming down, right on top of Camillo Junior High. Then, said Mrs. Baker, we wouldn't have to diagram any sentences for the rest of the afternoon. It might be worth it, whispered Danny. If Danny sounded a little snippy, you have to realize that his bar mitzvah was coming up, and he was more terrified of his bar mitzvah than an atomic bomb. He was really touchy about it, even when you tried to encourage him. You've been taking Hebrew lessons for this for a year, I'd remind him. Years. So, how hard can it be? How hard can it be? How hard can it be? How hard do you think it can be if your rabbi is standing right next to you and your parents and grandparents are watching you, along with every aunt and uncle and cousin and second cousin, even some you've never met, and two great-aunts who immigrated from Poland in 1913, and a great-uncle who escaped the Tsar, and every one of them is looking at you and crying and waiting for you to make a mistake, and if you do, they'll holler out the right word and stare at you like you shamed the whole family, and they'll never, ever be able to walk into the synagogue again. How hard do you think it could be? Maybe it would help, I said, if you scrunched under your desk and breathed quietly and evenly. Maybe it would help, he said, if I stuck this gum up your nose. Marilee and my tea and I decided we should find better ways to help Danny than putting gum up our noses. So every lunch recess, for most of May, we sat inside and listened to him recite what he was going to read at the service, even though we had no idea if the words he was saying were coming out right or not. And at the end of every recess, he was always ready to run away to California. I can't do this, he'd say. You can do this, we'd say. I don't want to do this, he'd say. You want to do this, we'd say. I don't even care about this, he'd say. You care about this, we'd say. It was sort of like a play, which, as you know, I have some experience at. That's how it went every day. You can see how that didn't put us in the mood for atomic bomb drills, which was too bad, since in May there wasn't a single day that went by that we didn't practice for an atomic bomb. Marilee and my tea spent most of the time under their desks softly singing the music from Camelot, which Mrs. Baker didn't seem to mind, even though there was supposed to be absolute quiet. Danny practiced his Hebrew, which is hard to do when you have your hands clasped over your head. I threw spitballs at him, which is even harder to do when you have your hands clasped over your head. And Doug Switek went to sleep, and when he went to sleep, he really went to sleep, let me tell you. You don't want to be in 7th grade and have people hear you snore. What you hear when you wake up is humiliating. Not as humiliating as yellow tights with white feathers on the butt, but humiliating enough. One of the atomic bomb drills came on a Wednesday afternoon, about halfway through the month, right about the time the Yankees were battling 187 as a team and were stuck in 9th place again, just like last year. It was one of those hot, still days that come before summer and that remind you what July is going to be like. When I scrunched under the desk, I could feel immediately that the air there was kind of heavy and steamy, and that I was going to start sweating pretty quickly, which I did. This was really unfair, since everyone else had already left for Temple Bethel or St. Adalbert's. I think that Mrs. Baker probably agreed. This, Mr. Hood, is ridiculous, she said, and she wasn't even scrunched under her desk. I leaned out from under my desk. My hands were still clasped over my head. Mrs. Baker? I said, even though I was supposed to be breathing quietly. Yes, she said. Would you mind not calling me Mr. Hood? It sounds like you're talking to my father. Mrs. Baker sat down at Danny's desk. You're still angry about opening day, she said. I just don't want to be him already. But you have similarities. Marilee showed me your drawing. It was wonderful. Anyone can see that you have the soul of an architect. Maybe, I said. But you want to decide for yourself, said Mrs. Baker. I nodded. I wanted to decide for myself. And you're afraid, said Mrs. Baker, that you won't get the chance. That I won't get the chance to see what I can do with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, I said. Not many people do, said Mrs. Baker. Even Hamlet waited too long. The sirens wailed as if to remind us that there was supposed to be absolute silence. This is ridiculous, Mrs. Baker said again. Here we are in the middle of Act 3, and we have to leave Shakespeare to curl up underneath a desk for an atomic bomb drill, which is, by my count, the 16th time you've practiced curling beneath a desk, as if anyone needed to practice curling beneath a desk." She rolled her eyes. Then she seemed to make a sudden decision. She gave up patrolling the aisles and walked back to the coat room. She seemed to be rummaging around, and then suddenly there was a crash and a splatter, and almost instantly the entire classroom smelled like the Long John Silver and his crew were yo-ho-hoing over bottles of rum, lots of bottles of rum. Mrs. Baker's voice came out of the coat room. "It seems that the crock with Mrs. Kabakoff's Pilgrim cider has fallen from the top shelf. Would you please run and bring Mr. Van Leary?" I did. When he came into the classroom, his eyes widened. "Smells like a brewery in this classroom," he said. "Indeed," said Mrs. Baker. "You'll have to air it out after you mop up the cider." "You can't stay in here with a smell like this," he said. "Do you think so?" said Mrs. Baker. She looked at me. "Then we shall have to go on a field trip." "A field trip?" I said. "We are going to survey points of local architectural interest." I thought for a minute. Are there any? Mrs. Baker had pulled her white sneakers out from her lower desk drawer. She looked up at me. "Yes," she said. We walked together to the main administrative office, where all the secretaries were scrunched up under their desks, and Mrs. Baker explained to Mrs. Sidman that our classroom smelled like a brewery, and that she certainly did not think she could keep a student there, and that she would like the opportunity to go on a field trip while Mr. Van Leary cleaned the room. Mrs. Sidman had one eyebrow raised the entire time she was listening, but Mrs. Baker had her arms crossed, and you know how convincing that can be. So Mrs. Sidman agreed, and Mrs. Baker filled out a form, and one of the secretaries crawled out from beneath her desk and called my mother. And then we got into Mrs. Baker's car, and she drove me around and showed me all the points of local architectural interest. We crossed over the Long Island Expressway to the north side of town and meandered down side roads until we stopped beside the Quaker Meeting House. This was built in 1676. Think of that, Holling. When it was built, people were still living who had been alive when Shakespeare was alive. 150 years ago, it was a station on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves hid right here. We meandered down more side roads. "That's the first jailhouse on Long Island," Mrs. Baker said. "It has 2 cells, one for men and one for women. The first man to occupy the cell had stolen a horse. The first woman had refused to pay the church tax because she was not a member of the church. She wanted to define freedom for herself. Think of that. You can see the bars in the windows where she would have looked out." We drove out to the east side of town and circled Hicks Park. This has changed a great deal over the years, but it once was Hicks Common, where the first settlers of the town grazed their cows and sheep. Those larger oaks, no, the oaks hauling over there, were probably saplings then, and the building backing up against the park, that clapboard building there, is St. Paul's Episcopal School, where British soldiers were housed during the American Revolution. The silver communion ware it owns was made by Paul Revere, and one of the original Hicks family members hid it in a cellar so it wouldn't be stolen during the war. On the south side of town, we passed Temple Emmanuel. "That is the 4th temple on that same site," said Mrs. Baker. "The first building was burned by lightning, the second by British soldiers who found out that the congregation was supporting the revolution, and the third by arsonists. In all those fires, the ark holding the Torah was never damaged. It's still there today. And on the west, on the far outskirts of town, We drove past what looked like a garden shed. The first abolitionist school.